All right, hi everyone. It's Andrew. I'm a CODA court support worker at Metro North Court, where many of you are, and we're very happy today for the North York HSJCC to introduce April Truitt, who's a registered psychotherapist, and she's going to speak to us about cannabis. I know there'll be a lot of questions. The presentation will probably go about 50 minutes, and then there will be time for questions after, which you can feel free to type in, and we'll read them after. And people who are joining us by webinar, so we are unmuted. You may need to adjust your settings at home, wherever you are. But we're going to begin the presentation now. So thanks, April.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And I know we only have an hour, and cannabis, I think, is it's a hot topic right now. I'm sure some of you saw the news with there was some discussion about the police officers who had edibles. I know that even people who don't normally get involved in the stock market are talking about like stocks and cannabis. I mean, cannabis is a really interesting topic right now. So I'm going to do my best to sort of give an overview of some of the issues regarding cannabis. We'll talk about the legislation that's coming to effect this year. We'll leave time for questions, and definitely this is definitely part of a larger conversation. So I should note that a colleague of mine, Julie Hansen, who's a family outreach and support worker with our FOR program for families, we developed a workshop targeting families of our service users to have a conversation about cannabis, to have a conversation about psychosis, and to have a conversation about what the current state of affairs is. So this is a modified version of about a 2.5 hour workshop. So yeah, I'm excited to be here. So really our agenda today is, let's see if we can get that we're going to look at what is cannabis really briefly, cannabis and psychosis, cannabis and brain development, and of course considerations with the Cannabis Act that's going to come into effect in July. But I thought we would have a little bit of fun. I know I don't have a live audience; it's just Andrew. But so some of the So some of the questions that if I was doing this in person, I would ask is, what is known as a popper? I'm sure some of you do know, some of you may not. I mean, poppers is a fairly recent phenomenon. It's a couple of years old. A lot of service users that I work with talk about poppers. And what it is people pack tobacco in a bong, and then they grind little bits of marijuana right on the top, so that when they're pulling hard on the bong, the marijuana actually makes a popping sound. So if you're working with anyone that talks about, having a popper, that's what they're talking about. Another one that's a little bit fun is, what is a Cocoa Puff? And I'm not talking about that yummy chocolate cereal back in our day. So a Cocoa Puff, it's not as popular as it used to be about 5 to 10 years ago, but it is putting a little bit of powder cocaine on top of your joint and smoking it. I think, what is indica and what is sativa? I mean, these are important things. So indica and sativa are strains of cannabis. And I think, as Canada regulates cannabis, all of us in the field and the general public are going to become a lot more knowledgeable about the strains. And really, when we're talking about strains, we want to be thinking about, what's the THC content, what's the CBD content. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. What are the impacts or the effects on people? And a lot of cannabis also is a combination of indica and sativa. But indica normally is grown inside. It's a smaller plant. A lot of people talk about if something has more of a indica mix, it gives a really strong body high. It's got wide leaves, and it's got a higher CBD property to it. Whereas sativa, it's more of a skinny plant that grows primarily outside because it can get skinny and tall. And when people talk about wanting a strain with sativa, they're talking more about wanting some of that mind high. So it's got usually a higher concentration of THC. People talk about it, improving clarity or focus or concentration. And what year originally did the federal Liberals say they were going to legalize cannabis? Andrew?
The original year was?
Yeah.
Gosh, I'm drawing a blank.
That's okay. I mean, it was supposed to be last year, and then they delayed it, and it looks like everything is in motion for it to be ratified. So that in July 2018, the Cannabis Act will come into fruition. I don't know if people know, Colorado and Washington, are sort of before us, Colorado especially. But what the Cannabis Act talks about is, so in July 2018, we're going to be able to get some cannabis products, but the government has said that they are giving themselves up to 12 months as of July 2018 to figure out what the edible market is going to look like, because that's going to be a really interesting market. And we'll talk about some of the experiences around Colorado and edibles. And then the last question are, what are some examples of edibles? And this is interesting. I don't know if people have an opportunity, if you Google edibles and cannabis, it's pretty amazing. I mean, Colorado has a tourist, is known as a cannabis tourist place, and they have really done a lot in terms of their edible market. Canada, it sounds like, is going to be a lot more cautious. So I did put some photos in here. So if we were in Colorado right now, Andrew and I could go out and we could go and get some cotton candy that had some cannabis in it. Or there's those Cali Gold chocolates. I mean, edibles are in the market right now. I work with a lot of service users that are lucky enough to find dispensaries that have edibles, or people are making edibles on their own. But right now, the edibles are being targeted. And edibles are really hard to find. But Colorado has had a difficult experience with edibles. So Colorado has pretty much put cannabis in everything from gummy bears to cotton candy to cough drops. It sounds like our government is going to be a lot more cautious. Our government really is looking at ensuring that the cannabis that is for sale isn't going to be marketing products that are targeting youth. Like tobacco, they're really cautious about the youth market. They really want to be mindful that some of these products aren't targeting children or aren't targeting youth. So it'll be interesting to see what edibles will be available legally when cannabis is legislated or legal. Thanks.
I have family in Colorado, by the way.
Ooh, interesting. And I mean, they're a couple of years in, so it's been a lot of learning, I think. Yeah. And I think that, the same for Canada, right? The eyes are on Canada, right? This is a pretty big deal. So we've got some states that are legalized, and we know that there are a number of other states that are going to be coming on board as well, Nevada being one of them. But I mean, we're a whole country. Really fascinating. I mean, I don't know if people have seen this product. So this actually didn't come from a dispensary. This came from a pharmacy. So there's a pharmacy in the city that's selling, hemp oil or extracted CBD oil. And this would still be considered illegal right now because it's got CBD in it. But this is another interesting product that's going to come available. So these CBD sprays, we've always had CBD pills at hospitals, but it'll be really interesting to see what products are going to be marketed. So anytime I have discussions with service users around the legalization of cannabis, I think something that comes up, especially with maybe some family members of people with mental health from my agency, is this concept of what's the relationship between psychosis and what's the relationship between cannabis use, and are we opening up the doors to seeing increased rates of psychosis or concerns around mental health when we talk about legalization. So just to sort of put it out there, what do we know so far about psychosis? We know that about 1 in 13 people in North America will experience psychosis. So that's about 7.5%. And that's getting a formal diagnosis of psychosis. We also know that sometimes when people experience effects of drugs, they might have a psychosis element to them, but this is actually people getting diagnosed with a psychosis through coming into contact with our healthcare system. So it means about 98% of regular cannabis users will not receive a diagnosis of psychosis. We've got about 1 in 100 people will receive a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So oftentimes in our system, we know that people sometimes may start out with getting a diagnosis of psychosis, and then other factors sort of come into play, and about 1% of the population will get a formal diagnosis of schizophrenia. And then we know that for people who use cannabis regularly, about 1 in 50 will receive a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So it looks like, again, that there is a relationship between cannabis use and a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but it might be not as large as people think. And there's a lot of discussion about what that looks like. I think, one of the benefits of legislation and interest in cannabis is that, this puts us in a good position to really do some research. Like what are rates of what are rates of psychosis or rates of schizophrenia going to look like, 10 years post legalization. But right now, we know that it's an association, but not a cause. There's a lot of different factors involved in cannabis and psychosis. I mean, there's been a lot of studies. Some studies have found as much as a 3-fold increase in psychosis with cannabis use, while other studies have found no increase in psychosis with cannabis use. And we know that research is flawed, and research, because cannabis is considered a controlled drug, research has some significant limitations. I mean, some of the limitations are that we're relying on people to self-report. They're self-reporting their experiences. They're self-reporting what they're using. Also, we know that, right now people buy cannabis off from an illegal market. We don't know what that cannabis is. We don't know, what the CBD properties are. So the CBD refers to the cannabinoids. We don't know what the THC. So the THC, I'm going to butcher the name, so I'm not even going to try. But the THC is really the psychoactive properties in cannabis, and we don't know what the balance is. So I think, Canada legalizing cannabis is really going to put us in a position where we can do a lot more research around this piece. And then when we look at the research around cannabis and psychosis, there's this discussion around reverse causation. So do people who have early experiences of mental health or early experiences of psychosis, are they drawn to using cannabis? Like, is it a reverse effect? Or, sometimes we think, okay, someone's been using cannabis a lot and they've got experiences of psychosis, so we're going to make an assumption that cannabis causes psychosis. But the flip side, the reverse causation might also exist, right? That people who might have a lot of internal stimuli might be drawn to cannabis to manage that stimuli. And then again, like one of the $1 million questions is, when we look at strains of cannabis, when we look at indica, when we look at sativa, when we look at strains of indica and sativa, and then there's other strains of cannabis, what are the effects of different strains on mental health or on psychosis or on addiction? There's a lot we don't know, because we don't know a lot about some of the strains. And one of the brilliant things about some of the dispensaries is, and they have a good, one of the things that the government has said is that when people are going to be going, when they're going to be ordering, because we know that one of the streams of getting cannabis recreationally, I mean, medically, you can order it online, or you can order it through the mail system. But one of the options for people in our country will be to order it through the mail, right? To order it online, and there's going to be it's going to be be fully visible in terms of how much CBD is in there, how much THC. They're gonna have discussions around around mold content. There's gonna be a lot of restrictions, which I think in the long run will be beneficial for the user. And I mean, so there's some really interesting stuff happening around cannabis in the world. Europe, as of 2017, there's some countries in Europe that are actually doing some studies on antipsychotic properties, or doing some studies on prescribing cannabis with high rates of CBD for people who are experiencing psychosis. So really interesting. So it'll be interesting to sort of see, what's this conversation going to look like in 5 years? What's this conversation going to look like in 10 years? But we do know that higher rates of THC, there is an association with higher associations of psychosis. And I'm sure some people have seen, some of the nature of things on cannabis. The NFB has done some movies or shows on cannabis. And we know that cannabis from 20 years ago is really different than cannabis now. We know that there is one thing that we can be sure of, is that cannabis on the market, especially not at the dispensaries, especially when people are buying cannabis off the street, we know that cannabis has higher rates of THC than it did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And that does have an impact on people's experience. And it does have an impact on people's experiences of psychosis, whether that psychosis develops into something else, or whether they have a drug-induced psychosis that stabilizes after someone after the withdrawal from cannabis sort of dissipates. Thanks, Andrew. And I mean, like anything around substance use, we know that there are multiple factors that affect why people may use more and why people may use less. What draws people to use, what allows some people to be able to put some limits. I mean, when a colleague of mine were looking at some of the research around cannabis and cannabis and mental health and cannabis and psychosis, one thing that stood out to us was there was a quote that said, the presence of childhood trauma and cannabis use increases the risk of psychosis to a greater degree than the sum of either risk factors alone. So we know that trauma for substance use is a risk factor, and we know that cannabis use is a risk factor for psychosis. It's not a causal factor, but it is a risk factor. But when we pair trauma and cannabis use, trauma and cannabis use, there is a higher likelihood or a greater risk of psychosis, which my colleague and I really found very interesting. And I know that some agencies in our sector, right, are looking at becoming more trauma informed. Trauma certainly is another topic that I think the healthcare sector is really looking at.
Certainly doing it in the court too.
Yeah, I'm sure. And another big factor that, when we look at the impacts of cannabis and we look at the impacts of psychosis or mental health is age. So we know that there is a stronger relationship around someone developing mental health or experiences of psychosis if they started, using cannabis at an earlier age. We don't know exactly what that looks like, but there is some research that shows that, when we look at brain development, that, the brain is still developing, and that's when people are, between the ages of 15 and, 24, 25, the brain is still developing, and this might be a risk factor in terms of, putting someone at risk of psychosis if they're chronically using. So age is an important factor, and then how often someone's using. So are we looking at occasional substance use? Are we looking at daily substance use? And what does that actually look like? Are they using, again, we're looking at different, what kind of strains they're using, what's the CBD content, what's the THC content. So there's a lot of sort of factors in the mix. So it's a really interesting sort of time period when we look at cannabis and mental health. And then when we look at cannabis and mental health, we should also look at brain development and function. So what do we know so far? So what does the research tell us? So we know that there is an association between persistent, so daily cannabis use over extended periods of time, starting in adolescence. And again, it looks like the research is talking about, periods between, 15, sort of teenage years, 15 and 24, 25, and changes in someone's IQ level. When I work with service users, oftentimes what people will talk about is, the motivation piece. They've noticed an impact on their motivation and memory. Memory really comes up when I work with people who may have started using cannabis at an early age. We know that it impacts learning, and then we know that it also impacts executive function. And what do we mean by executive function? Really, we're talking about self-regulation. We know that self-regulation, when we're looking at, justice involvement or employability, self-regulation is a factor that probably, if someone's got good self-regulation, it's probably going to minimize some of those factors around maybe getting involved in the justice system or some other factors. And then there's this really interesting thing around this gray matter and white matter. And, unfortunately, I'm not a scientist. I think, thinking about things now, maybe I would have been a scientist, because I think this is a really interesting area. We are looking at. Science is really looking at. So they're looking at, what are the impacts in terms of psychosis. They're looking at what are the impacts in terms of brain development and function, and they're definitely looking at structural changes in the brain. So what does it look like when someone's chronically smoking at an early age? What's the impact on structural changes in the brain? And is it reversible? So we're not, things are just coming to the surface. And I, by no means am an expert in this field at all. I've read, a couple of articles in this, and this is definitely on my radar. But this is something I think, we in the field will be hearing more about in terms of this piece. And then, unfortunately, do we know more or do we know less? So what do we not know when we look at brain development? So we don't really know, what is the overall level of impact on the brain? We don't really quite understand, when people are smoking cannabis, what might that impact be over time? We definitely have some indications on, PET scans, like what happens in real time, but what's the cumulative effect? And then again, this question of, was impairment of brain function present before starting cannabis use? So again, is there a reverse causation? Does someone who might have a learning disability or have some, executive impairments in terms of their brain, might they be drawn more to, to chronically smoking or to being pulled into cannabis and having more difficulty with limit setting? And then when we look at some social determinants of health factors, what's the impact of education on someone's brain function, right? When we look at people's educational experiences. And then again, what strains of cannabis and what effects do those have? So do strains that have higher THC, what's the impact in terms of brain development and function? And then again, there's some research that talks about how CBD might have a more protective factor. So if we've got strains that have a CBD content that's closer to the THC content, is that protective enough? And then again, of course, when we look at what people want to smoke, do a lot of the service users I work with end up smoking, cannabis that have a higher THC content, right? They're looking for more of that, that high or that mind effect. And then again, is it reversible, right? I think this is another really good question, but let me sort of keep going forward. So, just to wrap up, in terms of when we look at cannabis and psychosis, we know that, when people, are smoking regularly and use cannabis at an early age, 2% of the population might receive a diagnosis of schizophrenia, as opposed to 1% of the population who might not be chronic smokers. I've been to a number of presentations on cannabis over the years, and really, some of the more significant effects of cannabis is really, concentrated in a smaller group of individuals. So it's people who are heavy smokers or heavy cannabis users and regular cannabis users. And then again, some of the age range between 15, the impacts around these ages around 15 to 18 or 15 to 24. And again, there are many factors why people might use cannabis. And again, there are many factors why someone may experience psychosis that we didn't really talk about. And this is something I like to talk about too. If you do a chronology around, and we can look at this with other drugs as well. Like cannabis has this really interesting time period, right? It's been demonized years ago, wacky weed, and cannabis was really demonized. Reefer madness. We know that, there was a lot of racism around cannabis use and targeting cultural communities that may have been using it medicinally or religiously. And then we've got this romanticization of cannabis, right? That cannabis is this, this natural, amazing thing that has some real benefits for people. And then we know, unlike alcohol and tobacco, we know that nicotine does have some positive physical health components, but there are a lot more medical benefits to cannabis than there is for alcohol or for tobacco. And we know that, we normalize alcohol use, and we normalize tobacco use, although, tobacco has changed, in the last number of years. So soon, cannabis will become more normalized. And I think, CAMH and the provincial government will be developing, safer use guidelines like they have for drinking. But I think we have to be honest too, right? Like taking any substance carries some risk. So saying cannabis might be helpful for some people is not to deny that it may make others worse. And I think that's really a key message when I talk with families or when I talk with service users, right? It's not, we don't have to be so polarized around cannabis use. And then, there's a lot of discussion about, long-term use of medication. So there's some really not so great effects of long-term antipsychotic medication. There's some really not great effects of long-term use of pain medication. And what does that look like when we look at long-term use of cannabis? So sometimes we, demonize cannabis, but we're not applying that same lens to prescribe medication. So some really interesting pieces. Okay, but let's sort of go forward. So I put this case study in for, to really highlight that we're in a different time. So I do some consultations with addiction medicine doctors, with some psychiatrists, and an individual that I was working with, he's under the age of 25. He receives mental health and addiction services. He's got a formal diagnosis of schizophrenia. He's got a history of early cannabis use. So started, around 15, was a chronic user. Like many people, has had periods where he's used cannabis, periods where he hasn't. He did have some involvement with the justice system, has stable housing, lives with his parents, is prescribed an antipsychotic medication, been tried on a number of different antipsychotic medications. and goes back and forth about smoking cannabis, and sometimes his smoking cannabis really sees an increase in his psychosis symptoms, and sometimes it doesn't. And so the addiction medicine doctor, who I won't name, was really creative and said, you know what, because there was some polarization or struggles around this client navigating hearing voices and having experiences around mental health that were helpful and not helpful. And there was some discussion about how do we make the situation more helpful for him. So the addictions medicine doctor that I worked with said, you know what, I'm going to write you a prescription of cannabis. But the buy-in was, I want you to use, a strain of cannabis that I'm going to prescribe. And I want, and they navigated, what dose this client was going to use. So this client agreed that he was going to use less, and he was going to use this, a strain that no surprise had higher CBD over THC, but still had some THC, as a way to, to really work together to address, what things might help his client. And so I put this case study in because I think it was a good example for me when we look at when we're talking with service users and we're talking about families about how cannabis is gonna change, right? Like, what are some of the opportunities here in our healthcare system, and what are some of the situations where we're gonna be a little bit shocked and surprised? I mean, the situation, I think, really allowed this client to have a better working relationship with this addictions medicine doctor. The client ended up trying this different strain of cannabis, and we had to find a dispensary that had this sort of particular strain of cannabis. So that took a little bit of time. And and the client, the service user, stuck to it and didn't really, wasn't overjoyed about this strain of cannabis, but it really worked in terms of improving his relationship with the treating practitioner, and provided some choice and provided some options. So I thought it was a really neat case study. I'm going to go past this substance use continuum because I know we're a little bit sort of stuck for time. But I think when we look at cannabis use, we really want to be mindful of this substance use continuum, right? We know that some people, even with legislation, are still going to find themselves in this experimental use, right? They'll occasionally use cannabis. And then we've got people that are, going to be in this category of social use. And then we've got people who, might be in this regular use category. And then we've got this slippery slope, right? This blurry line between, what is regular use and how do we determine for an individual what's problematic or harmful use, and how do people kind of figure this out themselves? And then we've got dependent use. So I think, as we look at legislation, we want to be mindful of this substance use continuum. So if Andrew and I were both, service users that were using cannabis, Andrew might be able to stay in the social use category with ease. And I may move through this continuum, and I may get to problematic or harmful use without really understanding sort of how I got there and what that looks like. So it's just a framework I find really helpful when I'm engaging service users in terms of their cannabis use. So we don't get into discussions about, cannabis is bad, cannabis is good. It sort of looks at, what are the effects of your, cannabis use on you today, and what does that look like?
Almost more medical than moral.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, almost more medical than moral. I like that. And no surprise, Canada and the US, we like our weed. So this stat comes from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. But Canada is Canada has one of the highest rates of cannabis use in the world. So it's not going away, right? When I talk with families and service providers, and I'm, I was on the fence as well. I wasn't, legalization has a lot of stuff that comes with it, but I'm sure people can hear. I'm certainly more in favor of legalization than I was, a couple of years ago, or maybe even a year ago. I've been to enough discussions, read enough that sort of puts me on the pro legalization category. And this is a big one, right? And this is reported. 40% of Canadians have used cannabis, and that's reported. We probably know that's higher. And again, 20% of Canadians aged 15 to 24 have used cannabis in the past year. And actually, one of the higher rates of cannabis use is in this category of 25 to 34. So that's really interesting. So 70% of Canadian cannabis users are age 25 or older. And when you sort of drum it down, it looks like it's between 25 and 34. I mean, the government really is concerned about this 15 to 24 category. One of the big considerations in terms of legalization was looking at the research that we know with early brain development, right? That chronic cannabis use, or cannabis, while the brain is still developing, somewhere between, in your early 20s, puts you at greater risk. So shouldn't we have set the age limit at 24 or 25? But we also know that, 15 to 24 is a key demographic that's using cannabis. So how do we find the sweet spot between people using and between what the research says? And unfortunately, the government has had to say, right, we're going to make that, the provinces are going to decide. And it looks like, 18, 19, right, is going to be the legal age that people are going to be able to purchase cannabis. And we know that, or we're hopeful that, when people are purchasing cannabis from a regulated body, that the cannabis will be of higher quality. And there is some research, there's some interesting research studies that are coming from out west that show that when cannabis is higher quality, people end up smoking less, so that's good. But when people have cannabis that is lower quality or mixed with a lot of other garbage, that people end up smoking more or might be exposed to other substances. So one of the sort of pros around legalization is this piece too. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because I think we've been talking about this. But again, we know that cannabis use it's a drug, right? It's a substance, although it's natural. It is a substance, and that it does carry health and safety risks. And one of the big pros, let's just go to the next slide. One of the big pros around legalization is this piece. And when we look at cannabis use through an equity lens, and we look at the impacts of criminalization on people, we know that that Canadians getting arrested for simple possession charges is really an ineffective use of our criminal justice system. Right, so this should sort of clear up some of this piece, that nearly 3% of all arrests, were for simple possession charges, and that really, again, and we know that, when we look at those numbers, that it was from individuals who are from more marginalized, more racialized communities, more communities that maybe had issues of poverty. We really, the hope is that legalization is going to address this piece. And we know that, in the courts, right, having a criminal record is a pretty significant piece. So with legalization, they have said that, simple possession, people are not going to be charged for simple possession. People are going to be able to grow up to 4 plants in their home environment. But the government has said that they are going to target, though, the illegal market. And they are really going to target the illegal market and getting people who are going to be under the age, who are selling to people who are under the age limit in terms of cannabis use. So they are going to be really strict in terms of that piece. And when we look at cannabis, we know that there's the decriminalization. Portugal is a good example of this situation. Medical, right? We've got Canada's got a medical system, and then we've got this legalization, right? We know that Amsterdam, it's illegal. And Canada is going to have, it's going to be legalized. So, the production, distribution, possession are going to be removed from the criminal code. And we're going to have more of a health harm reduction philosophy and regulatory philosophy to cannabis use. Colorado is interesting. So Colorado's got a three-pronged system. So although in Colorado it's legalized, they've got a medical section to their Cannabis Act. They've got a section that applies to hemp products, and then they've got a section that applies to like recreational or cannabis tourism. So far, it looks like Canada is still going to keep their medical system. So there's going to be a medical, we've already got an infrastructure in terms of medical marijuana, and then we're going to have this recreational system.
Not a hemp system.
Not a hemp system, exactly. And this is, there's some discussion about this. I know that, there are, I'm sure people are aware that large companies, I'm not going to name names, large companies are gearing up because they want to sell cannabis, right? They want to be one of the retailers in terms of cannabis. And we know that dispensaries right now have a really good understanding of the market. So there is, I've heard some discussion that the dispensaries are petitioning the government and saying, you know what, right now the Canadian government has said, or they've let the provinces decide, and our province, our provincial government has said, the way that cannabis is going to be sold is medically, you're going to be able to still purchase it through, online or through the mail. Also in Ontario, you'll for the recreational side, you'll be able to purchase it online or through the mail, and then you're going to have these small like LCBO, right? Enterprises that will sell cannabis. But what about the shoppers or the drugstores, the Rexalls? I shouldn't just say shoppers. And what about the dispensaries? Where are they? Right now, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of friction in terms of what happens to the other players outside of the this cannabis LCBO. So we're still not sure what that's going to look like. Right now in the province of Ontario, it looks like they're really trying to sort of control that point of sale. And there was in Canada did a lot of discussion, they had stakeholders that they did a report, federal report where they went through the country and they talked about some of the issues. And one of the recommendations was to really look at this point of sale. What's it going to look like? And then because it's going to be different in the provinces, what does it look like if I'm in Ontario and then I cross over to another province? There still are some issues that are sort of gonna come about. CAMH, our friends at CAMH, thank you CAMH. They also have put out some recommendations. CMHA Ontario has done some really beautiful policy work, and also have got some recommendations around what Ontario should do when we look at legalization. And it looks like some of these recommendations were embedded in the Cannabis Act that soon will come into effect in July 2018. So they want a minimum age. We've set that. They want to limit availability. One of the benefits of like an LCBO structure is that there is going to be some limited availability. And one of the pieces is around, how do we figure out what's an appropriate price to charge consumers that's going to deter them from the illegal market and put them into this regulated market. So that piece is going to be interesting. I mean, I think the dispensaries have a better handle on that piece. And I don't know if anyone's ever been in some of the nicer dispensaries in the city, although they're acting still in an illegal framework. They have a really good sort of handle on what people are looking for, what pricing looks like. And then we've got some discussion like tobacco. I mean, a lot of the stuff in the Act is looking at our tobacco policies. They're going to really be mindful of marketing, right? And then again, I think I mentioned, they're going to look at making sure that when people are purchasing cannabis, they've got a good understanding of, how much THC is in it, what the CBD amount is, and then who's, some of our producers. We know that in Guelph and in Hamilton, there's alleys. I can't remember. I'm forgetting the term, but there's a part in Hamilton, that has all these companies that are going to be, licensed producers of cannabis, and there's some really strict regulations around mold content and making sure that this is a safe product for people to consume. And then the other big area that I think that the provincial government and the federal government are really looking at, the federal government, is around driving. So we know that in Colorado, one of the experiences of Colorado was, wow, they really didn't have a good handle on the impacts of on driving. Like, how do they figure out, what's an acceptable limit of sort of, cannabis intoxication and driving, and then how do they actually measure that? So I don't know if people caught, I think it was in the last 10 days, the Fifth Estate did a show, a program on, how Canada still doesn't have a good device in terms of measuring, the sort of intoxication of individuals that are driving. I mean, the interesting piece is, we saw in Colorado, and we did see in Washington. It's still early to see, and there was a drug policy alliance that's a think tank in the U.S. that has looked at, what are some of the experiences of Colorado and what are some of the experiences of Washington post legalization, and they did find that there was a slight increase in people using cannabis. And that sort of looks like it's tapered off in the heyday of legalization. And they did see a slight increase in cannabis use and driving infractions. But that seems like it's tapered off. I mean, in Washington, they saw a huge decrease in some drug-related crimes once cannabis was legalized. So that was a really interesting stat. But the driving piece is going to be an interesting one. That's, in terms of public safety, and sort of equipping, our justice system with appropriate mechanisms. That's one I think that we're going to have to really watch. I'm just being mindful. We're gonna leave a couple of minutes for questions. But I don't know if people have seen. They've got signs on TTC. But Weed Maps is a really interesting website. That's an online legal marijuana community that really allows, people who are cannabis connoisseurs to look at, what different cannabis strains there are, what's happening at local dispensaries. And there's some discussion. I mean, and I couldn't sort of. There is some discussion about whether they're going to allow still, some cannabis lounges to exist, where people can, go in a safe environment and use cannabis lounges. And then the government also has, some discussions around, we know that smoking, combusting substances does carry some health harms. So what does that look like when we say that, people, you've got some, legislation that looks at e-cigarettes and tobacco use. What does it look like in terms of cannabis? Yeah, some interesting stuff. So, I mean, I encourage people, if you want some nighttime reading, there is the Legalization and Regulation of Cannabis in Canada report that came out last year in November and really informed the Cannabis Act that is coming out, and it's got a lot of discussion about some of the nuances that the federal government looked at when considering legalization. So here are the important questions, right? What are some of the tensions in terms of legalization? So some of the tensions are, is our system ready? So July 2018, that's
coming up, actually. Yeah.
Right?
Start of February today. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's February. Are we ready? Like, do we have, in the province of Ontario, do we have, a good point of sale mechanism in place? I mean, we've got some, court cases that are going to come about? And do we have a good understanding of the differences between recreational point of sale and medical point of sale? And what's it going to look like for consumers? Is this going to deter people to buy cannabis from the illegal market? And what is the role of dispensaries? They've sort of they've been in it for a while. Where are they in this mix? What are some of the benefits to our system? What are some of the drawbacks? What is it going to look like in healthcare? What's it going to look like in the justice system? And what do service providers, what do we need to know? Like, what discussions are we having? So it's great that we're doing this webinar on cannabis. But I know at our agency, we've got a housing program, we've got an employment program. Like are there some unique things about cannabis that don't apply to other substances like tobacco or alcohol? I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of discussion. And I know that, a lot of the individuals I work with, it's been helpful and it's not been helpful that cannabis has really been in the spotlight. I have a lot of people, who may fit in that small category where, smoking cannabis really does, seems to have a negative impact on symptoms of mental health and puts them at greater risk of justice involvement, or puts them at greater risk of not keeping their housing, or et cetera, or how are they sort of navigating this piece? I mean, I know that even walking outside, sometimes I'm struck by, wow, like I really smell a lot more cannabis.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah.
So I know this was a really short snapshot about some of the sort of stuff that's coming with legalization. So I think we're sort of, it looks like it's 10 to 2, and I want to leave some time for questions.
Let me pull these up.
Sure.
Here. Yeah. Say I have about 1 million questions, but at the same time, I'm going to hold all of those because I know lots of people will. One person had typed in initially,
okay,
is it possible to print the slides? I know a lot of people would be interested. So.
I mean, I'm certainly okay with Dominica sharing the slides and emailing it out to people. They can have no.
It would go on the HSJCC
Yeah,
website,
perfect. So no problem with that piece.
Okay. Let's see here. So here we have, someone's written, the government is demonizing the use of marijuana, yet they want the financial gain of it. Do you not feel the laws in Ontario surrounding legalization is actually going to create more problems with their strict laws? And can we stop legalization and promote decriminalization? Great question.
You're right. I mean, I think, these are some of the nuances that exist in our context, right? That the government still, right? I mean, although we've got a federal government that committed to legalizing cannabis, we still are demonizing cannabis, right? I mean, look at some of the media stories, right? Even the media story around those police officers consuming edibles and having to phone back up. I mean, I would argue, right, that's really sort of, we're not having good, we're not having good conversations about, some of the benefits of cannabis use, or some of the hopes or goals of this. And you're right. I mean, governments are also interested in, in a piece of the pie, right? We know that cannabis is a widely used substance. Like alcohol. I mean, tobacco we know is much less used. So why not get some tax revenue from it, right? And I'm not sure. I really, a year ago, if you had asked me whether we could stop legalization, I might have said, you know what? I'm not sure government's there yet. I'm not sure legalization isn't just, it wasn't just a strategy to support an election. I really think that legalization is coming, and I'm really interested to see what problems that's going to create, and what what some of the benefits are. I mean, I definitely think that it is, the government did just announce in the last couple of months that, they're, of course, putting a small percentage. They're going to put a small percentage like they do with other legal substances, alcohol, gambling, and tobacco, to prevention, which includes treatment, which includes, early prevention strategies like going to schools and stuff. They are going to, they sort of are committing to that. But it will be interesting to see, even in terms of when we look at this through an equity lens, right? What, will legalization, does it level the playing field for individuals from marginalized communities, or does it not? I don't know if there's any other, what else do we have here?
Let's see. It says our
They are, and
illegal.
poor, my heart actually goes out to the dispensaries. They are operating, and maybe that's okay for me to say. This is certainly my opinion, but they're operating in a really tricky time period, right? We know that legalization is coming, and yet it is still illegal. I mean, dispensaries can't use an Interact system or anything. They have to keep, cash on them. They're ripe for robberies. We see still, and I feel for the police too. The police are in a really difficult position because the police, it's part of their mandate to crack down on dispensaries. But it really has put people, I think, in a really awful situation.
This is an interesting one. Is there, well, they're all good questions,
yeah.
But is there any research on cannabis interactions with antipsychotic and antidepressant meds?
Yeah, there is. And I would encourage people to, I think there's going to be more research that's coming out. I can see if I can find something and send it to the HSJCC around that piece. But, if you do have any connections to addiction medicine doctors, there is some research. It's very little, but definitely cannabis is hot, right? It's a really hot topic. And they are looking at, like I mentioned before, there is a research study in Europe that, is looking at CBD as an effective treatment for psychosis.
And so we also need to be aware of working with the marginalized population. Landlords are looking to change lease agreements around not being able to smoke in their place.
Yeah.
To service providers need to be prepared to work around this. If we can't smoke in public spaces or workplaces, and now landlords won't allow it in your home, where are we going to be able to smoke, and how are our housing options or availability going to change?
These are good questions, right?
Yeah.
Like tobacco. I mean, we know that smoke, whether it's cannabis smoke or tobacco smoke, or smoke from other substances, smoke, it does create some health issues, but it's true. Where are people safely able to consume products, right? And are there ways that we can minimize health risks while also allowing people to have some choice around what they're engaging in? And again, I mean, I think that our housing program, we've had some interesting discussions about even around this. The government has said you can have 4 plants. What does that look like? And how's that going to be enforced? And we're at a really hard place.
And someone's made the comment, I think the government put the horse before the wagon on this one.
Sure.
Although cannabis users are not recognized for outlandish behavior. Yeah, I think the management and organization of the business and distribution and health part should have been taken care of before legalization. How about this question? Are there any psychiatric illnesses that have strong contradictions against pot use?
I mean, we know that there is a relationship, and I think we're learning more about it. There is a relationship between chronic cannabis use from an early age that probably has higher THC levels and psychosis. There's definitely a relationship there. And you're right. And smoking is not the only way to use cannabis, right? There is a whole edible market. So when we look at and there's oils and there's vaporizers, and you're right, doctors. I mean, a doctor that I'm working with, I would not say their name. He knew that this client was gonna smoke. So he was more concerned about ensuring that the person that was going to use, an appropriate CBD, THC dosage. But I mean, cannabis comes in a lot of different forms, right? Edibles, oils, vaporizers, smoking. And the edible market will be interesting. Canada will be my thoughts are that Canada is going to be very conservative around the edible market. Very conservative. We did see in Colorado, like when there's anything new, we did see increased rates of hospital admissions from edibles, and we know that there isn't a lot of good information around how people consume edibles. So even in this recent police case or police situation, when you're consuming edibles, we know that it takes longer for the body to because you're eating it, it takes longer for it to be absorbed, and that people can consume more THC and CBD than they would if they were using a vaporizer or using a bong or smoking a joint. So we've got to be mindful of the edible market. But we did see in Colorado that when it's in gummy bears and when it's in energy drinks, when it's in cotton candy, that it does put children at greater risk because it looks like it's a candy product, right? And that if it's got if it's got cannabis in it, we've got to be really mindful of that piece. And also pets. I think the other piece is we have to be mindful that that it's going to be toxic for pets too. So we want to be mindful in terms of when we look at edibles.
Okay. Are the effects from marijuana reversible?
Oh, great question. I mean, again, I think, we right now the research shows that the significant harms, if we look at it through an addiction lens, the significant harms come from chronic early cannabis use. And we know that a lot of people don't chronically smoke, right? Just like alcohol, right? When we look at alcohol, early onset drinking for people is a risk factor to developing an alcohol use disorder later. And the amounts, right? How often people are using really has an impact. So I think we're going to start to get some more research around whether some of the effects from marijuana or cannabis is reversible. And yeah, cannabis, and I shouldn't say this, but my cannabis and edibles, I believe, is toxic for pets. But I imagine cannabis, the cannabis plant is toxic for pets, but I'm not 100% sure. I know that because in edibles, it's got such a high concentration. But I know that hemp, there are some pet products that have hemp in it that are actually beneficial. But hemp, again, is a different byproduct of cannabis than THC and CBD. So when we look at hemp and THC and CBD, those might be different because definitely hemp. I've seen some hemp products for pets.
Just while we have a second, let me just ask, in terms of it becoming legal and the government offering it, I've just wondered this.
Yeah,
I mean, there will always be organized crime to undercut.
Yeah.
They'll always provide a service for less or something that's illegal. But regarding the marijuana with the really strong strains of THC, maybe with some crap in it too, but that really brings those effects, either the downers and the uppers. Is the government, for those who really want that, is the government going to be able to supply that to people, or are they going to go to the streets?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Because I mean, the government is really going to be mindful, right? They're using research to look at, what's an acceptable THC level. What, when we look at different strains, what are acceptable levels? And they do have a sort of framework around, a range, and I don't know them off by heart, but they do have a framework around acceptable THC levels and acceptable CBD levels. And we know that a small, and these are probably for more of our sophisticated users, there might be a smaller percentage of people that might not be able to get the cannabis that has the appropriate strain that they want.
What they're looking for.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Interesting. And is there an association between high THC cannabis use and generalized anxiety disorder?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I definitely I think there is some research that shows that there are more experiences that would fit under anxiety that would come from a higher THC cannabis product than there would be with a CBD product. But I don't know the specifics in terms of actual diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder and a higher THC.
April, I really wish we could continue this, but I've had the message from the court. We're at time.
Sure.
We have to conclude. Thank you so much, everyone. Please do fill out the review forms of today's presentation, and I imagine people are going to have other questions. There'd be a way to contact you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think Domenica and I talked as well. I mean, I think, it might present an opportunity to do a webinar post legalization. So post July, what does it actually look like? So now that legalization is here, we've got a good understanding of what the point of sale is when service providers have are starting to sort of get their feet wet in terms of what they're seeing with their service users. I would be more than happy to sort of come back.
Excellent.
And I'm definitely by no means an expert. I really want to put it out there. I mean, I'm definitely cannabis is on my radar. There's been some great work that CMHA Ontario's done, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health done. I imagine there is on the PowerPoint, there is some reference to some research articles. There is definitely a growing body of evidence around cannabis.
Thank you.
Thank you.